I'm going to be talking to Duane Bratt, who's a professor of political science at Mount Royal University, about comments in a Reuters news story yesterday made by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau about Alberta and carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects and federal funding for them versus Alberta. And so welcome to the interview, Duane.
Good morning, Markham.
Now, these are really controversial. Premier Danielle Smith and Environment Minister Sonia Savage are up in arms. They're out in the media criticizing the Prime Minister. Basically, what he said was that Alberta hasn't been as interested in climate change policy as maybe he'd like to see them. And the Alberta government's running a big deficit, a surplus now, about $13 billion in this fiscal year. And they should start putting money into CCUS projects for oil and gas. What's your take on the controversy?
So there's a lot there. Let's just start with the carbon capture, utilization, storage program. This is something that I think all the major stakeholders agree on, whether that's the Alberta government, whether that's the federal government, whether that was private industry, particularly the large oil sands companies that are known as the Pathways Alliance. These are Suncor, CNRL, etc. The question is, how is it going to be paid for? And the Alberta government's position is that the feds should be paying for it. In the last budget a year ago, the federal government did set up a series of tax incentives for private investment in that, but they did not put much of their own money into it. This was felt insufficient by the Kenney government. They wanted to see more federal money going in, but they said, no, we're going to create an atmosphere for private investment. And this is a common tool. This was a tool that was used in the mid-1990s in an arrangement between the Chrétien government and the Klein government around tax incentives for private investment. And it worked. We can debate and discuss whether the royalty rates were too low, but it did increase investment through a series of tax mechanisms of cooperation between the feds and the provinces. In addition, if you go back to the beginning of the large development of the oil sands in the mid-1970s, it was under Peter Lougheed, a series of stakeholders coming together, the Alberta government, the federal government, the Ontario government, and the private sector in putting money together. So I think at the end of the day, that is what is going to be required. It's going to be private money, it's going to be government money from both the federal government and the provincial government. But the fiscal situation in Alberta is very different a year later. And I think that is what is drawing the ire of Justin Trudeau, that you're seeing a budget surplus in Alberta of $12 billion. Now, this year's budget has already been spent, whether that was putting money down on debt, whether that was an investment into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund or the Smith government's affordability package. But they're expecting a similar surplus next year. So I think Trudeau is right to say the Alberta government is sitting on a nest egg here. Why are they requiring federal dollars to do this? Likewise, the oil companies who had a very tough 2020 and a tough 2021 had a very, very good 2022. And they're going to have another good year this year. So I think Trudeau is correct in saying, well, what about you guys? You know, we provided tax incentives for investment. It shouldn't be government money. So really what we're talking about is how to split the costs up amongst these three large actors. And that's where the finger pointing is going at. So that's one part of the equation.
Duane, is this one of those cases where the federal government, the Alberta government is picking fights all the time and publicly criticizing the federal government, but meanwhile, there are conversations going on in the background that are very productive. I interviewed Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson about this, and he said that his relationship with the Alberta counterpart was very productive, you know, in meetings and so on. But it seems like that was the approach of the Kenney government, and the Smith government may be not quite as cooperative, even behind the scenes.
So to give you an example about that is I've got a forthcoming book chapter on Kenney's climate policy. And it's part of a larger volume called The Blue Storm, looking at the 2019 Alberta election and the first 3.5 years of the Kenney government. And I talk about private Kenney versus public Kenney. The public Kenney was almost dismissive of climate change, fought the federal government, sued over the carbon tax, created the war room, the Allen inquiry, all the things that we're familiar with. But privately, behind the scenes, was working with Trudeau on carbon capture, on small modular reactors, maintained, despite the lawsuit over the carbon tax, maintained much of Notley's climate leadership plan. The coal phase out is accelerating, and instead of hitting 2030, they'll hit 2023 to be out of coal. They didn't touch methane. They didn't touch the oil sands cap. They increased the industry carbon tax, the tier program, and even the consumer-based carbon tax, which they got rid of, the federal backstop kicked in. So you almost have to go behind the curtain to see, beyond the screaming and shouting, there was cooperation going on. There was actually a fairly good news story in Alberta, but the Kenney people didn't want you to know about it. In fact, Kenney could have ran completely as a climate change denier and won the 2019 election. He did not. He would talk about transition, which we're going to get into. Ironically, he wouldn't do it in Alberta. He would do it in Washington, and he would do it in Houston. But now we have the Smith government. And I'm not getting the same sense of cooperation behind the scenes under the Smith government as we saw with the Kenney government. So I think it's too early to tell there. I think Smith has raised the volume on the kicking and screaming, but I don't know if we're seeing similar forms of cooperation behind the scenes. My guess is probably not with the Alberta government, but probably yes with the private companies.
Well, let's talk about other comments that Trudeau made in that news story that have generated a lot of buzz. And this is the one that I think there's plenty of people in Calgary in particular who are upset about it. It's, quote, "One of the challenges is there is a political class in Alberta that has decided that anything to do with climate change is going to be bad for them or for Alberta," end quote. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and Duane Bratt wrote a scathing column against Trudeau on that. And for those outside of Alberta, Don is sort of the dean of Alberta columnists in the Calgary Herald. I think Trudeau was using his words carefully because he didn't want to name names. So he tried to use the political class. The problem with using that phrase, the political class, is it muddies the waters, and it seems to portray the entire Alberta government, the entire Alberta energy sector as being opposed to climate change. And yes, we can identify, the Brett Wilsons of the world that are, or the Lauren Gunters of the world who writes for the Edmonton Sun. But there's others that are much more progressive, like the Pathways Alliance. And as I mentioned, even the Kenney government, when you get rid of the rhetoric, was actually trying to work with the Trudeau government on this. So I think part of this is Trudeau was trying to not name names, but to identify a phenomenon that is occurring. But by doing so, he targeted the entire province of Alberta in that respect. Even the oil sector, yes, there are climate deniers, but not amongst the major companies. And I think that's kind of the problem that he got into. It's like when he started talking about, well, we're not going to transition today, but sometime in the future. And this is an old comment that has been brought up over and over and over again, that somehow Trudeau will try to keep it in the ground. And it relates to this whole debate about the word transition. For those that believe in a transition, they think it's a process, it's already occurring, it will continue to occur. But for others, they believe that transition means end the oil sector today. And so it's a question of time and pace and space. And I think that's kind of the problem. And nobody is going to give Justin Trudeau the benefit of the doubt. And that's also an issue at play here.
Well, let's parse what he said, because he didn't say the political class. He said a political class. And I
Yeah.
think there's a very good argument to be made that, in fact, there's a very large and vigorous political class in Alberta, often driven by and funded by the oil and gas sector. You mentioned Brett Wilson, who is, well known to many Canadians, but also a virulent climate, really a spreader of misinformation. There's a big AstroTurf organization, that's funded by the oil and gas organizations like Canada Action, the trade associations. Some of them have a very strong language, very, their narratives are very anti-climate change. Social media, I would argue that compared to other provinces, the Alberta mainstream media, like the Calgary Herald and so on, are not exactly climate friendly or energy transition friendly. So I think Trudeau was actually very accurate in saying a political class in Alberta.
But I could recite just as many that are supportive of that, supportive of action on climate change. We've clearly got a NDP government that or NDP opposition that could be government in May of 2023. We do have, as I highlight, the Pathways Alliance, the largest companies who are thinking outside of the jurisdiction of Alberta or the jurisdiction of Saskatchewan. So it's one of those, the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. Yeah, there is polling support that shows that beliefs in climate change are lower in Alberta than they are elsewhere. That is true, but there's still majority support in the province, right. And it's a much more nuanced situation here. I made some comments to a reporter, David Aiken, who's comparing Quebec and Alberta. And Quebec is much more in favor of stronger action on climate than Alberta. But how much of that is motivated reasoning? If Alberta had massive hydroelectricity and no fossil fuels, and Quebec had massive fossil fuels and no hydro, would their views be completely opposite of one another? And I think there's a strong case to be made for that.
Yeah, fair enough. But I think you put your finger on the problem here. There is a political class. There is another political class that is supportive of climate change. But I would argue that the political class, of which Brett Wilson is one of the leading proponents, dominates the energy narrative, the energy discussion in Alberta. I certainly see that on social media. I certainly see that in the mainstream
you get some
media.
of that same sort of public versus private debate that I mentioned earlier. I think extends beyond that. That the critics of climate are much more louder than the proponents, and I think that's an issue. And I do think that the Smith government, particularly with the Sovereignty Act and all the rhetoric around the Sovereignty Act, is different than the Kenney government, which barked a lot, but was also a lot more pragmatic behind the scenes.
So what does this mean between now and the election, which we assume is going to be called for late May? We haven't seen any, at least I haven't seen any indicators from Premier Smith that will change. Is this part of Danielle Smith's re-election plan for the UCP?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Smith desperately wants a fight with Justin Trudeau on any issue because Rachel Notley is much more popular in this province than Justin Trudeau is. So even the attack ads that have started to come out by third-party advertisers in the UCP are about Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh than they are about Rachel Notley. The Sovereignty Act is designed to provoke a response from Trudeau. He wisely has chosen not to. He wants that fight to occur in Alberta, and we're already seeing suits from Indigenous groups challenging the Sovereignty Act, and the Sovereignty Act hasn't been used yet. And depending on the day, in those year-end interviews, Danielle Smith was, we're going to use this, to, no, we're never going to use this. So Smith does want a fight, and I think that's why Trudeau's comments, which may have not been expressed properly, I think have been greatly inflated by a political desire to bring him into the fight.
Well, Duane, a pleasure as always, and we'll look forward to the next interview.
Okay, sounds good.